Welcome back to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology. I am Bram E. Gieben, an author, critic, and musician with a passion for philosophy, art, and culture. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm talking to Ali Maloney, an old friend of mine, a writer, rapper, performer, theatre maker, and podcaster whose roots are very deeply entangled with my own. So this should be a fun one. We did some early shows together as chemical poets before Ali went on to host the long-running experimental scratch performance night Anatomy and to create the critically acclaimed stage shows Hydronomicon and After Metamorphosis, based on the book by Franz Kafka. His short fiction has been published in the Nova Scotia Volume 2 anthology and other places. And under his alias Harlequinade, he's been the frontman of bands like Selene and Church of When the Shit Hits the Fan. In this episode, we're here to celebrate the release of the second season of his short form horror podcast, Caledonian Gothic, which returned in March for season 2. I'm very excited for you to hear all about this. It's an absolutely brilliant production, taking in experimental sound design, horror, and also for the first time, elements of Ali's own life and biography. So it's really fascinating. Let's get into it. Ali, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute blast to see you again.
Yeah, it's
I
good to
think
see you too.
probably the last time we hung out in person was my book launch, which was far too long ago.
Yes.
So yeah, and in fact, no, we came through for your birthday as well and hung
You
out in
did
some.
indeed for my surprise birthday, which was
Yeah,
great.
that was good, man. That
Yeah.
was good. So it's really great to get a chance to talk to you just about your kind of career generally, the trajectory it's taken, some of the projects you've done. So let's start by taking a little bit of a kind of deep dive into your background. I think I remember first encountering you doing an experimental hip hop performance in Edinburgh. And I remember seeing you rapping, but also slowly wrapping yourself and the stage with tape. And that would have been alongside Owen, known as Gung
Yes.
Hu. So tell us a little bit about Selene.
Okay, great. I think this is where a lot of this started. So I met Owen in about 2016. So I think it really started in what was the Left Bank. Myself and a pal Pete were running a DJ night there. And Left Bank's a venue that is long, long gone. But every Tuesday night we'd do like DJ hip hop and reggae, but gradually, and on the tables there was crayons, there was paper, there was all sorts of creative stuff going on, and I think more and more, both reggae and hip hop have evolved from DJ culture. So like there was this really nice thing of instruments got added, MCs got added, dances got added, some of which was in keeping with the cultures, some of it was way out. Out of the back of that, I met, so we actually performed, and I think out of that night, we created a hip hop group called Awkward Vessel with Chris, who's part of the Pen Pushers, and some others. Out of that, I met Owen, and I think we really bonded over our love of weird hip hop and experimental sound and kind of contemporary techniques. I think at the time I was always really interested in immersive theatre and physical theatre, visual theatre. And so, although the group was kind of at its core a hip hop duo, producer, MC, all that good stuff, I think it very quickly grew into being something weirder. Um, I think for Selene's second album, we both sat down and went, let's make a straight hip hop album. Let's just, no messing about, let's just make a straight hip hop album. But fully knowing that we're incapable of doing that. I think we both have our own twists and ways of going at things, and Owen's beats and my raps just would naturally mutate, and just part of the process was allowing that to happen. And yeah, some of the stuff you mentioned, I think as Selene's stage show got more elaborate, and it wasn't through going, hey, we want to just, there wasn't this grand plan of where it was going to go. It just would meet interesting prop makers or kind of other performers. At one point we were doing a gig where there's this fluid kind of lineup, and there was somebody playing an angle grinder on a kitchen sink while somebody else was making masks out of bacon, like on my face whilst I am performing. And I want to be clear, like this wasn't for the sake of it. One of the things that I was trying to do through my lyrics was create this kind of phantasmagorical, strange world in which these things kind of made sense. I always saw it. I mean, obviously, you know the Gorillas, how they're this cartoon band. I always saw Selene as being like the equivalent, but instead of animation, it was the animation of Jan Schwankmeyer, who is like this stop motion meat and nails and rusted bits kind of coming together in strange ways. So it really all fed part of that. But at its core, it was still a hip hop duo, and our two albums are out there. I still stand by them tremendously. So yeah, that was Selene,
Yeah, Riders
and
on
I
the Conquering Worm, I think, was the first one I
yes,
encountered. No, I mean, you introduced me to a lot of really great art in that period as well. Jan Svankmajer was one person. Other, crews like Plague Language. I definitely wouldn't have come across these things, and that was quite a kind of formative time, I think, for both of us. We were just like
absolutely.
sharing our influences, performing together. I don't know if I can take credit for this, but you did get sucked into the world of spoken word performance poetry as well. And we played a bunch of shows as Chemical Poets.
Yeah.
So explain what Kempo was and sort of how far we managed to push it.
Of course. So I would rephrase your thing, taking credit. I think I would use the word blame. So obviously, you saw us, and I think after we started hanging out, and you said, "Well, why don't you do this stuff at spoken word things?" And obviously, I was aware of the spoken word scene in Edinburgh at the time, but it wasn't something I really felt affiliated with. But obviously, you, myself, and Tickle, we all sort of, there was this real nice kinship of going, hey, we're all doing something different and unique with slam poetry, with performance poetry, where we all had these hip hop roots. We were all coming from slightly different angles, but at the same time, there was that energy, that performative energy that we all brought. And it was something really nice to kind of bring to those stages. And I think if it's just one person doing that kind of high octane, slightly off kilter um, thing on stage at these nights, it becomes an anomaly. But when there's a crew of three, I mean, everything's based on those rules of three, isn't it? That magic number. Just something really magical happened because we were getting, book deals, we were getting booked for all sorts of festivals, and there, it felt like there was a real gathering of momentum that maybe wouldn't have been accomplished if any of us had been doing it individually.
Yeah,
So
I'd agree
yeah,
with that. Yeah.
I think when we were doing Chemical Pulse, so I think it was like 2, maybe 3 years, we were really heavily active in things. And when you look at those early shows, which was us performing as a group, but one person would read a poem, then sit down, and the next person would sit down. And I think towards the end, when we're all kind of like jumping on top of each other, of like there's shared lines, the shared chorus, and everyone's just going at the same time. Um, I think we experimented with that in different ways. Sometimes it was overwhelming, but when we were at the core, like it was just incredible, and you could feel that from the audiences.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it was, we were in our 20s at the time. So a lot of that was to do with having the time, not having like serious jobs or other commitments. We were able to rehearse a lot. And so we sort of
Yes,
like knew each other's lyrics backwards. And I think you're right. I think the fact it was three of us like really did mark it out as something special. So that's an era I look back to with a lot of fondness.
me too,
I
man.
mean, we did a Chemical Poets Fringe show in 2010, and then you began kind of pushing things in an even more theatrical direction with shows like Hydronomicon and bands like Church of When the Shit Hits the Fan. So how were these received? I'm interested in what you think about where these things found their place in particularly Scottish culture.
S- Yeah, sure. So I'm going to jump forward a couple of years and then we'll jump back. So
Mm,
after we did that Fringe show, 20 Tentacle, I went on, did a physical theatre diploma and like really solidified my learnings there. And I think I kind of veered more towards there. A couple of years ago, so did this After Metamorphosis production, which was great, with Puppet Animation Scotland, funded by Creative Scotland. And I was reflecting on this. At its core, this felt like a Soletti show. Owen was doing the sound, I was doing the rap. We had Lewis Sherlock on movement, and there was video projection and all sorts of stuff. But it felt like at its core, it was just an extension of what we were doing as Selene. but reframing it as a theatre show, and not just a theatre show. This is, contemporary physical theatre. We even got written up in like contemporary puppetry journals, and it became a much easier sell.
Mm.
And like, it's not that I moved into theatre work because it is an easier sell, because it's still a hard graft and it's still a niche thing, but it becomes a lot more accessible to people. And I wonder if there's something about, if you take your average person and put them in an experimental hip hop show, they're going to go, well, I can't dance to this, and they're rapping too fast. I don't know how to parse this. If you take those same elements and go, okay, here's some contemporary theatre, all of a sudden, like that kind of internal framing device and how they parse the information coming in is completely rechanged. And there seems to be this much greater appetite for the strange and unusual in that way. So kind of jumping back, so how those things were perceived. I mean, it's taken me a long time to get to that stage. So I think there's the twin strands. So Churchill in the Shit's the Fan was obviously even more straight hip hop than Selene. And this kind of was another thing that came out of Chemical Poets, myself with Asthmatic Astronaut. That felt like everything was in place. Like, we were doing live sets on Radio 1. We performed at Tea in the Park. I was interviewed by the Sun, which is not necessarily a badge of honor. It's, probably a badge of shame. And I think the fact that the Sun has a culture section feels like a bit of an oxymoron. But like, it speaks to where that band was like in 2011, 2012. It just felt like we were so like just reaching spaces we weren't able. And I think that was a very conscious decision to take the raps that I was doing with Owen, which again are draped in mythology and surrealist imagery, but putting them on beats that are, far more accessible.
Mm.
You could dance to them. Just really, really worked. So that reception was great. And I think straight out of there, I did that theatre show, Hydronomicon, again with Asthmatic Astronaut. So this was badged as like a Churchill when the shit hits the fan play. And we did that during the Fringe, did it every night at the Fringe. And, like, again, it was a hip hop thing. But I'm in this clown outfit. We're in this dank, literal dungeon. And, I'd been studying kind of mime and gestures and clowning and bouffon and all these things that came into it. And again, I think that was the first glimpse of going, hang on a second, if I do the same stuff in a theatre context, like I'm not going, oh, I'm going to do kind of Waiting for Godot or something like really known as a theatre. I'm still doing the weird stuff. It just becomes so much easier, so much more palatable. So yeah, did Hydronomicon every day in the Fringe, and then resurrected it a couple of years later as part of the Shift Collective. I also, as part of that time, so out of the physical theatre course, I'd connected with Serge in Glasgow, who were heavily connected with that course, and had some funding to do another show, Ratcatcher. And I want to call something out. So I think it was performing a lot, and there was one show that did as Selene at the Traverse Theatre in the bar, and had a load of collaborations, and there was dancers and all sorts of things. And somebody came up to me afterwards, as they do, and they said, "Oh, that was really good." But I thought it was interesting that the men were doing all the music stuff and the sounds, and the women were just dancing or moving. And I was like, "Oh, do you know what? That's a really fair thing to call out." So I think Ratcatcher was a real deliberate way to kind of twist that, and kind of, because we were right to be challenged on these things. So Ratcatcher was something I did with Maz Marsden, Sarah Edwards on lights, and some other collaborators, but tried to really kind of diversify the creative team there. So that was a filthy fairy tale. The starting point was, that stereotypical fairy tale world, kings, castles, peasants, stick houses. Everyone would just smell like shit. Everyone's just rolling around in shit, and it would just be filthy. So I really wanted to push that, and it was like a real, like, the whole thing was like the rat catcher and his wife are living in this kind of cellar dungeon, that's too small, and above them are the the kings and the queens and the regals who are in this perpetual ball, keeping them awake. And it was this real nice play on class and inequality in a filthy fairy tale way. So yeah, so I think that's where, for me, like the stuff in Chemical Poets and that hip hop stuff and that spoken word stuff kind of branched out more towards the theatrical, and I think that's always where my head was at. And I do think it'd be really interesting. So, yourself, me, and Tickle, at the time of Chemical Poets, there was this convergence of where we were at, and it worked perfectly. And I think Tickle's, a master at the raps and the hip hop, and is, very straight. Like, he's brilliant. It's very straight ahead rap. There's no kind of weirdness to it. And myself's gone way down this theatre path, but there's still a hip hop element to it. And yourself, you have kind of, with like Old Boy and Elevate and Incubate and all these, like, have taken that into a more kind of cyber dystopian, and the spoken word and the hip hop is still there. I think it'd be really interesting to see what would happen if we all came together and did what we did with Chemical Poets, but where we are right now. I know
Mm.
scheduling's a nightmare, and I know, like, that thing about when we're in the 20s, we don't have jobs, we can just do whatever. None of us are quite have the luxury because I mean, we're not 20 anymore.
Yeah, that would be
Let's
the challenge, wouldn't it? We'd have to like
yeah,
rent a castle and go there for 3 weeks and devise a
that sounds
show or
awesome.
something like that. Maybe we'll be able to find the funding for that at some point. I wanted to go back to the training in physical theatre because I could see what a powerful influence this had. You started moving differently on stage, like
Yeah.
even before you were creating these shows. For people that don't know, I mean, people will obviously have an impression of clowning as being a certain thing, but Buffon and the way that manifests in physical theatre is obviously very different. What was it like to study that? Where did you study, and sort of who were the people you were learning from?
Yeah, sure. So I think it'd been a fringe not long before then. A pal of mine, Sarah, who does lights for lots of fringe shows, or did at the time, called me up and was like, "You've got to see this show. You've got to see this show." So I went to see The Fooligan by Alcide, and it just blew my mind. And it was a spoken word thing, but there was this huge, like, this huge fat suit. It kind of tapped into some of those fairy tale aesthetics I was already interested in, and the precision of movement and all these, like, just the way somebody can just stand on stage with nothing but their body and create worlds. Just kind of, it just flipped a switch in my mind. So I looked into this guy, and he was running this diploma in the Arches in Glasgow, and I think, it was coming up for 30 at the time, and going, actually, I'm too old to be like retraining or taking a year off work to study and do all that. And then I was like, well, why? Like, what's life for if not for just going after these things and doing these things and living these things? So I studied that, and I want to be clear, like, it was quite a comprehensive course. And if anybody's listening is unsure what I mean when I say physical theatre, traditional theatre, which I'm fairly sure people have a sense of what that is, traditional theatre prioritizes the word and the script and the dialogue and the language. And that's not to say there's no physical things, that's not to say there's, these other things, but the predominant focus is the dialogue. And I love that, like, I love Shakespeare, I love Kafka, and, Samuel Beckett's adaptations of Kafka and all these things. Physical theatre is flipped. It's not that there aren't words, but the predominant focus is the physicality, the staging. There might be puppets, there might be mime, there might be all these things. So it became really interesting to kind of marry them up, because I still consider myself at my core like spoken word, even though I don't always necessarily consider myself a spoken word artist. The spoken word is always really central to what I do, because I consider myself a performance writer. So it became an interesting way to go, well, how do I elevate what I'm doing to include this kind of physicality, and whether that is mime or clowning or Buffon, which I think we'll need to define what Buffon is. It became so much more powerful. And when I was designing Hydronomicon, one of the things that I was really interested in was the aesthetics of stand-up comedy. So if you have some, and which is not that far divorced from spoken word, somebody stands up and there is a microphone and nothing else. How do you create an all-encompassing, immersive theatrical experience with nothing else? You've got your body, there might be props, but there's not a set, there's not a stage. um, I think it became a really powerful part of my arsenal. And that course, I've also did like technical ballet and things like that I wouldn't normally seek out, but I don't want to say that's informed me. I don't think I bring technical ballet into things, but it's just that it was like quite a broad thing. But it was clowny enough that at the time I could say, I'm going to clown school. And that was important to me.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I mean, I think at that point, 2/3 of the Chemical Poets were clowns. Like
Hmm.
Tickle was being an anarchist clown at the same time,
Yeah,
and doing these protests, often dressed as Ronald McDonald. Um,
absolutely.
so yeah, it was an interesting kind of influence to bring into the mix. So since then, as well as working on these stage shows, you've focused a little bit on writing horror. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, you've sold some of your work, including a story in Nova Scotia Volume 2. Nova Scotia, the original collection, was a bit of a groundbreaking thing, sort of bringing together science fiction and weird fiction writers from throughout Scotland. Volume 2 came out last year, and it was a new crop of people. So I'm interested in what you're writing at the moment besides Caledonian Gothic. We were both affiliated with Writer's Block, which is a
Yeah.
collective in Edinburgh that run workshops and occasionally put on performances. Are you still rolling with those guys?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm still trying to churn out short stories, and like I recently sold a story to Cosmic Horror Monthly, which was great, and it was nice. So I finished off the year with like my name on the front cover, which was brilliant, great to see. So I'm trying to sell short stories. I am working on the second draft of a novel, which I'd like to finish off. I mean, I thrive in collaborations because you get held accountable, and that's
Mm,
nice. You have a rehearsal studio booked, and somebody else comes in and that energy. And writing is such a solitary activity. It can be really hard to keep going, and it can be really hard to, you know, be distracted or procrastinate. And I think just having that regular writing group where we meet once a month and cret, and that becomes a mechanic by which you get held accountable, and people are reading stuff. And I think that's always the motivating factor is you write, well, I do, and I think a lot of people do, but it's not the only way, is that you write so that people consume things. It's one of the fundamental human needs to be seen, to be understood, to be heard, to have the ideas that you have rattling around in your brain, communicated to another person. And that's just a core human need. And whether that's writing or just explaining yourself or being hugged. It is just a way of going, I am here, see me. Um, so writing long form fiction, you kind of remove that, and because these things, I know people can write a book in a month or two. I can't. I've got other things going on. It's going to take me ages. I know, although you do get that recognition, hopefully, touch wood, the journey to it is a lot longer. And I think this is where performance becomes really powerful because you do it then and there.
mm,
And whether it's good or bad, you get a reaction immediately. Whereas that kind of long form writing, you don't. But the regular writing group, where you can send a couple of chapters at a time or however it works, you get that feedback and you get that recognition, and you get all the warm, fuzzy feelings that something you have created has manifested in somebody else's mind.
yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I actually went on to the Glasgow MLit course.
Mm,
And I think I came in the door wanting to write a crime novel and left writing sort of experimental, like critical nonfiction. So
great.
that was a similar thing to your course in that it sort of changed the direction of travel. But yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying about like writing being a way of being seen, and also that the path of a novelist is a much lonelier one than other
Yes.
approaches you could take to it. One thing that's like impressed me from day one about your writing is just this rich visual sense. Like you're a very sensual writer, even when you're writing about quite horrible things like gore or monsters or, hauntings. Um, you know, what influences are you sort of channeling there? Where does the imagery come from within you?
Can we just stop and just go, hey, are monsters, gore, and hauntings not sensual in and of themselves? Where did that come from? Um, so I mean, like a lot of people in my generation, Clive Barker and the cinematic adaptations of that, Sean Hudson, which I read at a far too young an age. But I think more than that. So I'm of the generation that was just coming to kind of like awareness about where I fit culturally. When video nasties were a thing, and going to the video shops and seeing these covers and reading about them and reading about these things that were dangerous. You watch this, and you're going to become a crazy psycho, and I didn't see them because I wasn't allowed to. I was also like too young. But you go to the video shops and you'd see these covers, and I think I spent a lot of time imagining what they were. Because if somebody says you can't watch this, it's going to be too damaging to you. And so as a child, I spent so much time just being like, what could possibly be what they are saying it is? I now know those films are, not really worth the hype, and it's that Streisand effect of debating them in Parliament brings them to the awareness. But I think that had happened in other things, because you could ask a similar question about my approach to kind of like stagecraft. And I remember I spent a lot of time in New York as a kid and reading the Village Voice about all these show listings. Like I remember I must have been 8 or 9, and Mayhem were doing a show in New York. And obviously, I wasn't going to go, and I had never heard Mayhem, but I knew they threw razor blades into the audience, and there were severed pigs' heads, and all these things. And I just spent so much time like being forbidden to see things or engage with things that I just created this notion of what they are.
Mm,
And I think, yeah, I think that is the roots of a lot of my thinking about art and my imagery and all these things, and the notion that a book could be damaging to you mentally, could just send you spiraling, or a film, or a piece of music that was, yeah, dangerous. That was really informative, and the absence of these things, I think, was a bigger influence on me than if I had engaged with them in
yeah.
a direct way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I can remember something similar. Maybe this is a product of being an 80s kid. I remember going to the video shop and looking through the covers of films, which obviously is
Mm,
not something you do when you're looking for a film on Netflix. Like
yeah,
if you land on the cover on Netflix, like it auto plays the first minute or
yeah.
whatever. But I remember similarly, I wasn't allowed to rent horrors. And the covers that I would always return to scare the absolute shit out of myself would be the Freddy movies and the movies House, the series House. You've probably, yeah, I imagine
I've
you've got
got
that
it
up
on my
there.
VHS right here. Yeah,
And
I've
they were
got
never as
House 2.
scary. There you go.
No, they're
I used to
not.
look at the cover of those movies and scare myself silly with how scary I thought they were. But
Yes.
particularly rewatching the Elm Street movies recently, is a lot of it's just like slapstick comedy.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not very
Absolutely.
scary. So I think my dreams and imaginations of that were a lot more potent than the actual films once I got to watch them.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's the core of it. And like, isn't it weird? Like for us as kids, like Freddy Krueger was there was a cartoon, there was a comic, there were like cuddly toys. I think it must have been my like 10th birthday. There was Monkey Business costume shop with something like the Freddy Krueger glove. And like that's all I wanted. That's all I want. And obviously I'd never seen any of these films, but there was this, I don't want to say cultural osmosis, because it became really twisted in that osmosis, that you're
Mm,
aware of this thing and you imagine what it is. And it wasn't that thing. It becomes something, but isn't that the core of horror? Is the unknown is more frightening. The unexplainable, the thing that is hidden, is worse than the thing that is there, because the thing that is there is a man in a costume and there's a zipper up the back and
yeah,
and a boom mic comes in shot. But the thing that isn't there is way more terrifying and kind of frightening. And I read Naked Lunch at far too young an age, which, was just bamboozling. And all I got of the sense was, there's oozing centipedal tentacles, worming between the words and from page to page and scene to scene. And it made no sense to me, absolutely zero. But the kind of overwhelming sense was of this gnarly, gritty, sensual atrocity. Yeah, which is amazing. And I think a lot of the time, right, like I saw Tetsuo, it was on Channel 4, again, far too young. And it's this thing where I recorded it and then I watched it for like 5 minutes and I was like, nope, this makes no sense. It's horrible to look at. I hate it. Why would I watch this? And then it just kind of festers in my mind. And it's like, and I come back and I'm like, wait, wait, let's go and watch it again. And yeah, Tetsuo's a trip for a
Yeah,
9-year-old.
Tetsuo and Tetsuo 2 Body Hammer. I remember watching
Yes.
those far too young as well. I think the early manga stuff that was coming into Britain at the time on VHS definitely kind of led me to a love of cyberpunk as well. I'm not sure I would have gone into the William Gibson sort of side of things had I not read that, seen those tapes around my mate's house. And, that's something in a way that Calgoth, Caledonian Gothic, the podcast channels a little bit, is this idea of finding media that leads you to a strange place. But I think there's a lot to what you're saying as well about the unseen being the scary thing. I mean, Alien is the classic example. That's the scariest one because you don't see the monster until quite late on. I recently watched the new Duffer Brothers show, Something Bad Is Going to Happen. Now, the first 3 or 4 episodes are fantastic because the horror is about what you suspect rather than what you can see. But then as soon as the lore is introduced, it sort of stops being scary and you go, oh, okay, it's just about this, it's about a particular plot point. So from that point on, it's not scary.
I remember when the first Silent Hill film came out, and I was, I'm not saying I was blowing me away, but it was, in the town and it was weird. And then at some point, somebody just stops and there's a voiceover. It's like, now let me tell you what's been happening and what's going to happen. My heart just sank. I'm like, I should just walk out now because as soon as you bring exposition into it, and it's interesting. So like I've been playing like Hollow Knight, the video game, and looking at that and like looking at the lore videos and the use of environmental storytelling where there's this huge expansive mythology, but at no point does anybody goes, okay, this is what's going on, this is why the bugs are like this, and this is why the moths are like this. There's this ability, just this faith in the audience to piece things together. And even if you don't piece together the full picture, just knowing that piecing things together on your own makes it so much more powerful. It's that, the expression, if you want somebody to do something, persuade them it was their idea, because everybody wants their idea. And I think it's the same. If you say to somebody, okay, well, this is what it's about, this is what the monster looks like, this is why it's doing it, this is, that is less powerful than having the viewer connect the dots and go, oh, wait, that and that and that. And I think this. And then, their pal might think something different. That's so much more powerful.
Yeah, no, we live in a very sort of like a lot of the stories that are popular, obviously science fiction, fantasy, horror, these are all like more popular genres than they used to be. They were quite niche when we were growing up. But now a lot of the things you encounter are very lore heavy. And people like to sort of like dig into the lore and they become very bloated towards the end. let's talk a little bit about the podcast then. So how
Sure.
did this passion for horror that you discovered growing up sort of lead you to Caledonian Gothic? What was the initial genesis there?
Okay, so I think before any of the things that we've spoken about, before anything, like I just wanted to be a horror writer. You know, reading
Mm,
Sean Hudson, Stephen King, Lovecraft, Clive Barker, that's all I wanted to do. You know, and when you talk about House and like in all these films, the main character was a horror author who'd taken their typewriter off somewhere to work on. That was all I ever wanted. That's all I ever wanted to do. And in my mind, when I was doing that spoken word, when I was making that theatre, when I was doing that hip hop, all I was trying to do was channel the writing that I wanted to do in that medium. And it wasn't until, you know, coming through all that, I was like, well, actually, I think at the core, I am a horror writer, maybe a very weird horror writer. And, you know, the worlds are different, the creatures are different. And I think that initial season of Caledonian Gothic was like, I want to tell these stories. I want to start honing in on that and, you know, not necessarily scraping away the exterior or the extraneous stuff, but let that horror come to the fore in a way that it maybe wasn't at the fore in other works. Um, I do like playing with form. I do like Lost Highway was a really pivotal film to me. And I remember seeing that when it came out and then reading an article, and I wish I could find the quote, but somebody said to me, it's it's a film about a haunting, but the film itself is haunted. Like, you know, the way the narrative works and the framing works. And I was like, whoa, you could do that. And I think that that is very strong. And I think that's in the forefront of my mind when I've been doing any of the Caledonian Gothic stuff is it is about hauntings, it is about ghosts, it is about those mysterious things that happen in horror, but I want it itself to be haunted in the same way. And again, like, you know, that ties into the narrative. What does that mean for the characters in the story? What does that mean for a listener? I really like the way, like, some things bring the reader, the listener, the audience, whoever it is consuming it, how do they become part of the story? And one thing that's really nice with doing it as a podcast is I know somebody's listening to it. If they are hearing these words, like if they are hearing that story, they are currently listening to it. I don't know anything else about them. I don't know how they're listening to it, but all I know is that there is audio going on. It's like, great, okay, how do I use that? Um, and you know, in the first season, like I was trying to, you know, speak directly to the listener, and you know, kind of skirting with that alternate reality game, and you know, trying to be like, you know, borrowing that kind of second person present tense from, you know, actual plays of role playing games. And so you do this, you are doing this. Like if you are listening to this, like blink, and just trying to all I know is that they're listening to it. How do I leverage that to bring the reader, the kind of listener, into the story? And with the second season, I mean, I don't want to kind of go too much into it. So the first season was very heavy on the you do this, you are doing this, this can you do this? It might feel like a first glance that is not in the second season, um, but I but it is
mm.
in a very real sense. So that's what it was. Like, how do I tell horror stories in an audio way? But also, I have brought to this, you know, all the experience of being on stages, the experience of making shows, the experience of just making live art that people engage with. I do like that, you know, it's in one sense, it is theatre in a very accessible way. Like it's completely free to access. All you need is internet and some way of playing audio, and you can access it. You know, it will never have ads. I will never charge for it. It is just there to experience.
That's fantastic. Um, I mean, season one was very much a sonic tapestry as well, but season two, it feels like you've gone even deeper into that because sound and recording are also sort of part of the narrative. In the
Mhm.
first episode, you say words are spells, sound is ritual. Um, Haunting, memory, music, sound, these are all sort of themes that emerge in the first few episodes. Why did you choose to make these central to the story, and tell us a little bit about the contributors to that soundscape?
Yes, absolutely. So I think again, this is an audio medium, and how do I use that? And I do understand some people don't like music in their podcasts, or some people like to listen to it at two speeds or whatever, and I can't control that. I want to create. It's that thing, when I'm saying about standing up as a spoken word show, and I just have my body and the microphone and nothing else. How do I create a world? Here, all I have is my voice and sound. So the first season was a very maximalist approach to that, very big drones. I did all the kind of sound design in the first season by myself, apart from the theme tune by Amber Devereaux from Tin Can Audio, who's a great composer. The second season, I wanted to branch out, so I have reached Gareth Burry, aka Asthmatic Astronaut, who was my collaborator in Church of When the Shit Hits the Fan, Hydronomicon, and other projects. Came on board to do the sound design, and again the theme tune by Amber Devereaux. And it was really nice to kind of collaborate with uh, G on this. Great compositional mind, really interested in how sound design works. So yeah, that is, and it also brings a different energy. So that first season, I my release schedule was quite punishing because I released episodes every fortnight, and nothing was done in advance. So one episode would drop, and then in 2 weeks I would write an episode, record it, do all the sound design and the editing, and it became quite punishing. And I think that self punishment came through. Whereas this time, like, it's all done, and me and Gareth have been back and forth, and with all the sound designs done, it's all mastered, and just because it is about sound, I think it became really important that this is really crisp. And I
Mm,
know a lot of the sounds referred to in the songs referred to in this season might not necessarily be crisp, but the story about them is. And
yeah.
also, it's a delight to work with G. He's a real talent, and I'm blessed that he would do the sound
Yeah.
design for this.
He should be familiar to fans of Strange Exiles as well, because he wrote the theme for us.
Great.
G is sort of the sonic architect behind so many of the projects that we've been involved in. So yeah, definitely shout out to Asthmatic Astronaut. Um,
It's
so
it's
that's
interesting. So, like, before we go on, I just want to call out, Chemical Poets and that kind of orbiting selection of collaborators. We're all still friends. We all still work together,
we
and I
do.
think that's really beautiful. Like, a lot of crews from 15 years ago are not all still like at the drop of, like, I could phone up anybody and just be like, hey, could you help me with this project? And I would reciprocate the same. And I think that's a real beautiful, strong thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
No,
call that out.
totally agree. I think, like, when we split up the label that we had, Black Lantern, we all had big ideas of sort of going off and working on solo projects, and we all have, to varying degrees of
Yeah,
success and acclaim, and that's all good. But there was something quite pure about that period where we were almost like a production unit. You could call
yeah.
in different elements or different people to work on different bits. So I was glad to see that sort of continuing in this podcast as well. So I wanted to ask about the structure of the second season. You sort of hinted that each episode is a separate tale, but that they'll come together slowly over the season. How,
Yep.
how did you sort of land on this approach?
So I have listened to a number of horror podcasts or audio dramas, and I love them. And I think it was listening to them that gave the initial spark, the initial catalyst that people do this, and this is something you can do. I think it's quite standard. If you listen to like Archive 81 or the Magnus Archives, there's some of these things where each episode is a self contained tale. And oh, would you believe it? Kind of an overarching narrative gradually emerges. And I do quite like that. And I don't know how much that ties into the attention span of 2026 and how people engage with media. But to that point about, the big expansive lore, people do like a bigger story. I think for me, there was a very particular story I wanted to tell that could not be told directly, could not be told in a single story. So, and I don't want to kind of go into what that is, but that thing about the environmental storytelling and how things kind of coalesce and congeal into something. So that was really core to the structure. I think ritual is also really important to the structure and the story and the narrative and the world in which it inhabits. Um, so that's how it was. And it, at a practical level, it's really easy to go, hey, here's 6 stories, listen to them all in order. If something else happens, that's on you.
Mm, mm. No, that's good, man. That's good. And one other aspect of the season so far that I've really enjoyed is it's quite meta. You know,
Yes.
you've got elements of your real life and also from your performance career, kind of coming in alongside these supernatural and hauntological themes, and it's very difficult to see where the joins are and what's real and
Uh-huh.
what's not. Um, yeah, you know, there's one episode which is set during an experimental theatre cabaret. There's another which kind of is a bit about like a gig. Did you intentionally want to make something a bit more personal this time?
So, yes, I also like, I think weird fiction, which I think this sits in rather than horror fiction, there's a real strong precedent for, like, the blending the reality of the author and the story. I mean, I could sit here and be like, oh, it's all true. That's what it is. And um, maybe it is. But like, I think there's a real strong precedent. But I also think there's a reason why movies say based on a true story. There's a reason why Blair Witch Project, when it came out, was like, well, this actually happened. This is just film that's discovered. I think, and going back to that notion that, hey, some media is dangerous, that ties into it. And you can only kind of leverage that if it is real, if
Mm.
these things actually happened and the things discussed are out there in the world.
Yeah, no, I love that, and it's a really powerful sort of evolution of what you were doing in season one. There's some sort of commentary on season one as part of
Yeah.
season two, which I thought was very clever. So I'm excited to hear more of that. What's your vision for Caledonian Gothic going forward? Obviously, audio is so key to it, but do you envision it maybe taking shape in another form of media as well? Is that something you'd be open to?
So I would love to do a stage show as part of the development of this. I spent a fair bit of money and time on eBay buying old tape players. So I've got a pile of like interesting visual tape players, and I really like the idea of doing a stage show. There was an opportunity to do something at the Vault Festival in London when I was developing it, but kind of like, after chatting with G about it, we're like, actually, this is great, but all of a sudden, all the work being focused on developing this is going to be diverted to develop a stage show. Um, but I've got this world here, and I think I'm very clear on what Caledonian Gothic is as distinct to my other performance projects. And I'd love to make a stage show where you tell these stories, but bringing in tape players and physical things. And I'd love, I've been reading a lot and studying a lot of like stage magic, and I'd love to bring some of that in. And so ritual's really core to this, and real magic, not kind of wave a wand magic. That kind of notion of sacrifice, intent, intensity, and all participants being party to this. The notion of doing that on stage is really, really appealing. I think so. Stage shows are difficult because, if there's lots of people, it becomes, with After Metamorphosis, where we were talking about doing a tour, the funding fell through, but, we would have had to hire a big transit van. There's big pieces of set, there's, kind of 5 people on the go. I really like the notion of just something I can fit in a suitcase and
Mm.
rock up and have suitcases full of tape players. I've got a USB stick with the soundtrack and a mic, and just go, right, this is it. This is the world.
That's really interesting. I'm also very interested in the show in a backpack concept.
Yeah, yes.
And I think it does take a lot of work to put all of that on one person's shoulders. But the technology is there, like you say, and that's one thing that you've always incorporated is like defunct technology. You've always
Yeah,
had that
yeah,
fascination with that, so I can see how that would work. I mean, you mentioned Archive 81 earlier. I loved that podcast, and eventually that got turned into a Netflix show.
yeah.
Would you be comfortable with people adapting your work, or?
So yeah, like that thing that I said earlier about like this is all a way to be seen, to be heard. I've got all these ideas and tentacles and spidery bits, rattling around my imagination, and it's just a way of going. And like at some point somebody did some fan art for Caledonian Gothic, and I was like so touched. I was like, it doesn't matter whether that is what it looks like in my mind or not. You have like I've made something, put it out into the world. You have absorbed it into your brain and done something else with it. And that's magnificent. Like, what higher compliment? Like, I remember when I was rapping and I got an email from somebody, I think in Pittsburgh or something, being like, hey, just wanted to, like, I've decided I'm a graffiti artist. I'm calling myself Harlequinade. I was inspired by what you do. Like, just wanted to let you know. I'm like, wow, that's the nicest thing. Like, what I do is not for it's not for mass appeal, and I'm not against that. It's just weird and niche and individual. It doesn't have a mass appeal. But when you have one person somewhere in the world go, hey, this spoke to me, like that's great. So if somebody wants to adapt this, I mean, I found the Archive 81 Netflix adaptation fairly unsatisfactory.
Same.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's the notion. Like with audio, there are no visuals, so the imagination, the listener is fundamentally a part of the show's DNA because they bring their own thing to it. It's the same when books get adapted. It's like it loses a certain quality. But if somebody wanted to adapt this in any way or like work with it, like I can't think of no higher honor than somebody going, "Hey, that thing, can we build on that?"
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I wanted to ask a little bit about Lovecraft as well. You briefly mentioned him earlier. The logo for Caledonian Gothic is sort of a podcast mic with a wonderful Cthulhu spreading out of the
Yes.
bottom. Your work's always had these sort of Lovecraftian overtones.
Yep.
Do you think Lovecraft is sort of a writer who has influenced you? Or do you think that vein of cosmic horror, he's like Lovecraft is almost like a genre unto itself?
Good question. I will say, look at the logo. It's also a thistle because it's Caledonian
Yeah.
Gothic. So we've got the mic and Cthulhu, but it like in its whole, it's a thistle. That's an interesting question. So like I love Lovecraft, and I think that was my gateway into cosmic horror and the weird. But I think at a certain point, it's not about his writing. It's definitely not about his views outside of his
Mm.
writing. Um, in Jeff Vandermeer's introduction to The Weird, which is this great collection of short stories, there's a thing about the tentacle, because tentacles come up a lot, and that's the thing. And he says that the tentacle is like an avatar of the weird. It's like a symbol that immediately goes, okay, there's something eldritch and uncanny and strange and otherworldly here. And I think Lovecraft is also an avatar in that way. And sure, like we could separate that and just be like, oh, we're talking about cosmic horror or the weird, but it becomes a real nice shorthand to go, okay, this is where we're at. And I love the stories. I love the world. This is where we've got interconnectedness. This is where we've got like these narrators recounting these retales. Like they all start, oh, you might think I'm mad, or I'm in this insane asylum, or about to jump out this window, but let me tell you why. And once I've told you, you'll understand. So I think that a lot of these cores are there, but these tentacly cults operating behind things I think it's very influential. Pickman's model, again, is something I read far too young. I was like, wow, I didn't know horror could do this. And there's a lot of ambiguity. And that's
Mm.
another thing and not just in that the monsters are all indescribable, because I think that's a bit of a cop out. Um, but the world, and why are these things happening, and where are these things come from, and who are these mysterious cloaked figures who are suddenly watching me while I'm recording this? That ambiguity is, so fundamental to it all. So that's the influence that I carry, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting that indescribable horrors, that is a bit of sort of like Lovecraft trope, but maybe that
Yeah,
connects back to the idea of like, don't show the monster. Like if it's
yeah, absolutely.
unnameable and indescribable, you're always going to imagine something more
Yeah,
spooky, more creepy, more weird
yeah.
than is on the page necessarily. Yeah, you used the word Eldritch. I found out recently that that has an originally a Scots origin, right? So
Awesome.
I think it's a 16th century word meaning, creepy, unnatural.
Yeah.
Um, what is it about Scotland's culture that lends itself so much to tales of the Gothic, tales of the supernatural?
There was a pull quote from The Wire did a review of a Pen Pushers album, and I used this, even though this wasn't a review for a project I was involved in. Obviously, the Pen Pushers were great, and I knew them. But The Wire reviewed one of their albums, and it said Edinburgh is the most kind of quintessentially crepuscular city. And these rainy cobblestones, and I think wandering around Edinburgh, the architecture, the you know there's a reason why Frankenstein was filmed here, and all these other, it is inherent in like my walking about. They've got the castle up there and all these hauntings, and I'm sure every city has this, but I remember being very young, like all these ghost tours and going on ghost tours and hearing about, this piper who disappeared under this tunnel, and this woman who was hung but then came back, and I'm just surrounded. And I, I'm fairly sure every city has their own ghost tours, and I don't think that's by any way unique. Um, but yeah, I think for me, and there is a lineage that could be tied back to Robert Stevenson, or all these kind of writings, canonical things that have happened here. But I think for me, it is just the architecture, and just it is where I grew up
Yeah.
with all that aforementioned dabbling in the horrors.
Yeah, there's so many good examples of ghost stories from Scottish literature. I mean, even
Mhm.
things like Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I mean, I would
Yeah,
place that in the horror genre, and maybe
yeah,
that goes back to us having an oral culture, and that telling
yeah,
ghost stories around a fire was always a thing we've done.
yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with you about the architecture too. There's nothing quite as eldritch as Edinburgh in the fog.
Yeah, absolutely. It's beautiful.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Listen, this has been such a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. We could probably go for hours and hours. Before I let you go, tell me, what is the best way to support the podcast and stay up to date with episodes?
So it should be available on all podcast platforms, absolutely everywhere, including Audible. I'd love if people went to it on Audible. But Bandcamp, so Bandcamp, you can get it high quality. All the podcast platforms, it's a really shoddy quality just by the nature of the dissemination. Bandcamp, you can get high quality. You can donate. We've also got the transcripts there, and the lyrics. So every episode will have full transcripts, and that's also just a nice community. I support Bandcamp. I'm always going to like people engaging with it on Bandcamp. Um, so there, follow me on Blue Sky, and that's it. Just I think actually the best way to kind of engage with further things is when you're in the woods, passing by a tree, just listen.
Well, I've got to say, there is absolutely no fucking way I'm listening to this podcast in some spooky dark woods. I will be at
Okay,
home with the lights on, listening
okay,
to it on Bandcamp, so I get the full effect of the high quality
yeah,
audio.
good.
So I definitely recommend everybody go and check it out there. Ali,
Thank
it's
you.
been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on Strange Exiles.
It's been a pleasure, Bram. Take care.
So, you've been listening to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology, hosted and produced by me, Bram E. Gieben, with a theme by Asthmatic Astronaut. My guest today was Alistair Maloney. You can follow him on Instagram and Blue Sky via the links in the show notes. Make sure you check out Caledonian Gothic at calgothpod.bandcamp.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If this is the first episode of the show you've checked out, thank you for listening and subscribing. You can join in the conversation over at strangeexiles.substack.com, where you'll find a whole bunch of links, reading recommendations, and the names of some of the thinkers, movies, musicians, and writers that Ali and I talked about today in the episode. So thank you very much once again, Ali. And until next time, take care of each other. Bye, folks.